So in this lecture, we're going to talk about attitudes, behaviors, and persuasion. Let's start with attitudes. What's your opinion on the death penalty? What political party does a better job of running the country? Should prayer be allowed in schools? Should violence on television be regulated? Chances are good that you have fairly strong opinions on at least one of the questions that I just asked and many similar other ones. This is because you've developed attitudes about such issues, and these attitudes influence your beliefs as well as your behavior. Attitudes are an important topic of study within the field of social psychology. But what exactly is an attitude and how does it develop? An attitude is our evaluation of a person, idea, or object. Another way we can think about them is a learned tendency to evaluate things in a certain way. This can include evaluations of people, issues, events. Such evaluations are often positive or negative, but they can also be uncertain. So for example, you might have mixed feelings about a particular person or a specific issue, or sometimes you stand one way on a certain thing, but sometimes you stand a different way. Researchers also suggest that there are several different components that make up attitudes. The components of attitudes are sometimes referred to as CAB, or the ABCs, depending on the order you put them in. So there's the cognitive component, your thoughts and beliefs, what you think about a subject. The affective component, so how the person, issue, or event makes you feel. And the behavioral component, so how that attitude then goes on to influence your behavior. So where do attitudes come from? First, our experiences shape our attitudes. This is partly because of the recognition heuristic, which says that we're more likely to believe something that we've heard of over time. So if we hear something over and over and over throughout our lives, we're more likely to believe it. This helps to explain things like why we adopt the religious or political beliefs of our parents. Additionally, our attitudes are associated with our personality traits. So political conservatives tend to be more fearful, more sensitive to threat, and less tolerant to uncertainty than political liberals. There's a number of factors that can influence how and why attitudes form. So, for example, they often form directly as a result of experience. They may emerge due to direct personal experience. So say you know someone who had an abortion and you really understood their reasons and they really resonated with you. That experience may then shape your attitudes regarding abortion rights. Social factors like social roles and social norms can have a strong influence on attitude. So social roles relate to how people are expected to behave in a particular role or context, while social norms involve society's rules for which behaviors are considered appropriate. Attitudes can be learned in a variety of ways. Think back to a few weeks ago when we talked about learning and behavior. And so consider how advertisers use classical conditioning to influence your attitude towards a particular product. In a television commercial, you see young, beautiful people having fun on a tropical beach while enjoying a cool, refreshing sports drink. This attractive and appealing imagery causes you to develop a positive association with this particular beverage. Operant conditioning can also be used to influence how attitudes develop. Imagine a young man who's just started smoking. Whenever he lights up a cigarette, people complain, chastise him, and ask him to leave. This negative feedback from those around him will eventually cause him to develop an unfavorable opinion of smoking, and he'll decide to give up the habit. And finally, people learn attitudes by observing those around them. When someone you admire greatly espouses a particular attitude, you're going to be more likely to adopt that same way of thinking. For example, children spend a great deal of time observing the attitudes of their parents, and so it's unsurprising that they usually begin to demonstrate similar outlooks. Now, we tend to assume that people behave according to their attitudes, but social psychologists know that attitudes and actual behavior are not always perfectly aligned. Plenty of people support a particular candidate or political party and yet fail to go out and vote. Speaking of which, you should always vote. Doesn't matter who you vote for, but you should vote. People also are more likely to behave according to their attitudes under certain conditions. So in some cases, people may actually alter their attitudes in order to better align them with their behaviors. This is known as cognitive dissonance. Let me explain a situation that happens to me all the time. So I'm a morning person. You probably have seen me sending emails and messages at like 6:37. I'm up early. And I try to go to the gym early in the morning, particularly on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, because I like the classes those days. I know going to the gym is healthy. I usually like it once I'm there, plus I pay for membership, but sometimes I wake up and I just really don't want to go today. I'm tired. I have so much work to do. It's raining, but I know it's good for me. Ever have something like that happen? I'm sure you have. This is known as cognitive dissonance, or a situation involving conflicting attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. So this produces a feeling of mental discomfort leading to an alteration in one of the attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors to reduce the discomfort. Another way to explain it is a phenomenon in which a person experiences psychological distress due to conflicting thoughts or beliefs. To put it more simply, it's when your thoughts and behaviors are out of whack. Here's another example. When people smoke, which is a behavior, they know that smoking causes cancer, which is a cognition. So they're in a state of cognitive dissonance. This was first investigated by Leon Festinger, arising out of a participant observation study of a cult, which believed that the earth was going to be destroyed by a flood. And what happened to its members, particularly the really committed ones who had given up their homes and jobs to work for the cult, when the flood didn't actually happen? While the fringe members of the cult were more inclined to recognize that they'd made a fool of themselves and put it down to experience and get back to reality, the more committed members were likely to reinterpret the evidence to show that they were right all along, or that the earth was not destroyed because of the faithfulness of the cult members. So what can we do about dissonance when it occurs? Imagine the following situation. You've always placed a high value on financial security, but then you start dating someone who's very financially unstable. To reduce the tension caused by the conflicting beliefs and behaviors, you have a few options. You can change your thoughts, you can change your behaviors, or you can develop some new information. So in this scenario, you could end your relationship and seek out a partner who's more financially secure. That would be changing the behaviors, or you can de-emphasize fiscal stability importance. You can change your thoughts. In order to minimize the dissonance between your conflicting attitude and behavior, something's got to give. You have to change something. Or the third option is that we can acquire new information that outweighs the dissonant belief. So for example, we might say, well, this partner just got a new job, so they'll likely be more financially stable in the future. Now, notice that dissonance theory does not state that these models of dissonance reduction will actually work, only that individuals who are in a state of dissonance are going to take steps to reduce the extent of that dissonance. It's an uncomfortable feeling, and so we like to do what we can to get rid of it and restore that balance. Okay, so say you always thought you were an honest person. You have a history of being honest, you've never had any problems in the past, and then you cheat on an exam. This is going to result in dissonance because there's two conflicting ideas. So I'm an honest person is now conflicting with I cheated. So we can reduce the conflict in a couple ways. First, you can change the cognition. So maybe saying, all right, maybe I'm not that honest after all. This is cognition A. You could change the second cognition by rationalizing away the cheating. Well, I didn't mean to look. I just sort of saw someone's answers accidentally. I was sort of stretching and looking around and my eyes landed on their paper by accident. Or you can introduce a third cognition to resolve the conflict. Maybe something like, well, I had to cheat because the test was unfair. Or I didn't have time to study because I was working on a paper, so I had no choice but to cheat. So these are some of the strategies that we can take when we are in a situation where we have conflicting feelings resulting in that dissonance. When you think about persuasion, what comes to mind? Some people might think of advertising messages that urge viewers to buy a particular product, while others might think of a political candidate trying to sway voters away or sway voters to choose his or her name. Persuasion is a powerful force in daily life and has a major influence on society as a whole. Politics, legal decisions, mass media, news, and advertising are all influenced by the power of persuasion, and they influence us in turn. Sometimes we like to believe that we're immune to persuasion or that we have a natural ability to see through that sales pitch or comprehend the truth in a situation and come to conclusions all on our own. Now, this might be true in some scenarios, but persuasion isn't just a pushy salesman trying to sell you a car or a television commercial enticing you to buy the latest and greatest product. Persuasion can be subtle, and how we respond to such influences can depend on a variety of factors. When we think of persuasion, negative examples tend to be the first to come to mind, but can also be used as a positive force. So, public service campaigns that urge people to recycle or quit smoking are great examples of how persuasion can be used to inform people's lives. In the dynamics of persuasion, Perloff defines persuasion as a symbolic process in which communicators try to convince other people to change their attitudes or behaviors regarding an issue through the transmission of a message in an atmosphere of free choice. I like that definition. The key elements of this definition of persuasion are that they involved a deliberate attempt to influence others. Okay, so we are going in with the goal of changing someone else's mind. The idea that people aren't coerced, they're free to choose through self-persuasion. That persuasive messages are transmitted in a variety of ways, and this can be verbal or nonverbal, through television, radio, internet, or face-to-face communication. And that persuasion is symbolic. We use words, images, and sounds, the tone of our voice. It's not just about what we're saying. So why is persuasion important? Well, that can vary based on the context, but let's think about it from the perspective of trying to shift other people's views. The elaboration likelihood theory of persuasion suggests that people can alter their attitudes in two ways. First, they can be motivated to listen and think about the message, leading to an attitude shift. This is known as the central route, which thoughtfully evaluates merit and focuses on the informational content of the message. This route uses an analytic model of thinking. Remember, we talked about the different models all the way back in the beginning. We tend to take this route when we're motivated and able to evaluate information carefully. So imagine you've been accepted to 2 colleges and you're trying to decide which one to attend. You have plenty of time to decide and lots of relevant information. You've been to visit, you did a tour, you've talked to current students, etc. Or they might be influenced by the characteristics of the speaker, leading to a temporary or surface shift in attitude. This is known as the peripheral route, which makes snap judgments and only focuses on surface aspects of the decision being made. With the peripheral route, we're using an intuitive model of thinking. We're focusing on how appealing or interesting things are. This is the path we tend to use when we're not all that motivated to really think through things carefully. So they tend to be more short-term and less consequential decisions like which shirt should I wear today or what should I have for dinner? The ultimate goal of persuasion is to convince the target to internalize the persuasive argument and adopt this new attitude as part of their core belief system. So let's wrap up this section by talking about some of the different effective techniques you can use to persuade others. Or perhaps someone has used them on you. So first I want to show you this video, which is narrated by Dr. Robert Cialdini and Steve Martin, not the actor, but they are both experts in persuasion.
Researchers have been studying the factors that influence us to say yes to the requests of others for over 60 years. And there can be no doubt that there's a science to how we are persuaded. And a lot of this science is surprising. When making a decision, it would be nice to think that people consider all the available information in order to guide their thinking. But the reality is very often different. In the increasingly overloaded lives we lead, more than ever, we need shortcuts or rules of thumb to guide our decision making. My own research has identified just 6 of these shortcuts as universals that guide human behavior. They are reciprocity, scarcity, authority, consistency, liking, and consensus. Understanding these shortcuts and employing them in an ethical manner can significantly increase the chances that someone will be persuaded by your request. Let's take a closer look at each in turn.
So, the first universal principle of influence is reciprocity. Simply put, people are obliged to give back to others the form of behavior, gift, or service that they have received first. If a friend invites you to their party, there's an obligation for you to invite them to a future party you are hosting. If a colleague does you a favor, then you owe that colleague a favor. And in the context of a social obligation, people are more likely to say yes to those that they owe. One of the best demonstrations of the principle of reciprocation comes from a series of studies conducted in restaurants. So the last time you visit a restaurant, there's a good chance that the waiter or waitress will have given you a gift, probably at about the same time that they bring your bill. A liqueur perhaps, or a fortune cookie, or perhaps a simple mint. So here's the question. Does the giving of a mint have any influence over how much tip you're going to leave them? Most people will say no, but that mint can make a surprising difference. In the study, giving diners a single mint at the end of their meal typically increased tips by around 3%. Interestingly, if the gift is doubled and 2 mints are provided, tips don't double. They quadruple, a 14% increase in tips. But perhaps most interestingly of all is the fact that if the waiter provides 1 mint, starts to walk away from the table, but pauses, turns back, and says, "For you nice people, here's an extra mint," tips go through the roof. A 23% increase, influenced not by what was given, but how it was given. So the key to using the principle of reciprocation is to be the first to give and to ensure that what you give is personalized and unexpected.
The second universal principle of persuasion is scarcity. Simply put, people want more of those things they can have less of. When British Airways announced in 2003 that they would no longer be operating the twice daily London-New York Concorde flight because it had become uneconomical to run, sales the very next day took off. Notice that nothing had changed about the Concorde itself. It certainly didn't fly any faster, the service didn't suddenly get better, and the airfare didn't drop. It had simply become a scarce resource, and as a result, people wanted it more. So when it comes to effectively persuading others using the scarcity principle, the science is clear. It's not enough simply to tell people about the benefits they'll gain if they choose your products and services. You'll also need to point out what is unique about your proposition and what they stand to lose if they fail to consider your proposal.
Our third principle of influence is the principle of authority, the idea that people follow the lead of credible, knowledgeable experts. Physiotherapists, for example, are able to persuade more of their patients to comply with recommended exercise programs if they display their medical diplomas on the walls of their consulting rooms. People are more likely to give change for a parking meter to a complete stranger if that requester wears a uniform rather than casual clothes. What the science is telling us is that it's important to signal to others what makes you a credible, knowledgeable authority before you make your influence attempt. Of course, this can present problems. You can hardly go around telling potential customers how brilliant you are, but you can certainly arrange for someone to do it for you. And surprisingly, the science tells us that it doesn't seem to matter if the person who introduces you is not only connected to you, but also likely to prosper from the introduction themselves. One group of real estate agents were able to increase both the number of property appraisals and the number of subsequent contracts that they wrote by arranging for reception staff who answered customer inquiries to first mention their colleagues' credentials and expertise. So, customers interested in letting a property were told, "Lettings? Let me connect you with Sandra, who has over 15 years' experience letting properties in this area." Customers who wanted more information about selling properties were told, "Speak to Peter, our head of sales. He has over 20 years' experience selling properties. I'll put you through now." The impact of this expert introduction led to a 20% rise in the number of appointments and a 15% increase in the number of signed contracts. Not bad for a small change informed from persuasion science that was both ethical and costless to implement.
The next principle is consistency. People like to be consistent with the things they have previously said or done. Consistency is activated by looking for and asking for small initial commitments that can be made. In one famous set of studies, researchers found, rather unsurprisingly, that very few people would be willing to erect an unsightly wooden board on their front lawn to support a Drive Safely campaign in their neighborhood. However, in a similar neighborhood close by, 4 times as many homeowners indicated that they would be willing to erect this unsightly billboard. Why? Because 10 days previously, they had agreed to place a small postcard in the front window of their home that signaled their support for a Drive Safely campaign. That small card was the initial commitment that led to a 400% increase in a much bigger but still consistent change. So, when seeking to influence using the consistency principle, the detective of influence looks for voluntary, active, and public commitments, and ideally gets those commitments in writing. For example, one recent study reduced missed appointments at health centers by 18%, simply by asking the patients rather than the staff to write down appointment details on the future appointment card.
The 5th principle is the principle of liking. People prefer to say yes to those that they like. But what causes one person to like another? Persuasion science tells us that there are 3 important factors. We like people who are similar to us, we like people who pay us compliments, and we like people who cooperate with us towards mutual goals. As more and more of the interactions that we are having take place online, it might be worth asking whether these factors can be employed effectively in, let's say, online negotiations. In a series of negotiation studies carried out between MBA students and 2 well-known business schools, some groups were told, time is money, get straight down to business. In this group, around 55% were able to come to an agreement. A second group, however, were told, before you begin negotiating, exchange some personal information with each other. Identify a similarity you share in common, then begin negotiating. In this group, 90% of them were able to come to successful and agreeable outcomes that were typically worth 18% more to both parties. So to harness this powerful principle of liking, be sure to look for areas of similarity that you share with others and genuine compliments you could give before you get down to business.
The final principle is consensus. Especially when they are uncertain, people will look to the actions and behaviors of others to determine their own. You may have noticed that hotels often place a small card in bathrooms that attempt to persuade guests to reuse their towels and linen. Most do this by drawing a guest's attention to the benefits that reuse can have on environmental protection. It turns out that this is a pretty effective strategy, leading to around 35% compliance. But could there be an even more effective way? Well, it turns out that about 75% of people who check into a hotel for 4 nights or longer will reuse their towels at some point during their stay. So what would happen if we took a lesson from the principle of consensus and simply included that information on the cards and said that 75% of our guests reuse their towels at some time during their stay? So please do so as well. It turns out that when we do this, towel reuse rises by 26%. Now imagine the next time you stay in a hotel, you saw one of these signs. You picked it up and you read the following message. 75% of people who have stayed in this room have reused their towel. What would you think? Well, here's what you might think. I hope they're not the same towels. And like most people, you probably think that this sign will have no influence on your behavior whatsoever. But it turns out that changing just a few words on a sign to honestly point out what comparable previous guests have done was the single most effective message, leading to a 33% increase in reuse. So, The science is telling us that rather than relying on our own ability to persuade others, we can point to what many others are already doing, especially many similar others.
So there we have it, 6 scientifically validated principles of persuasion that provide for small, practical.
So I know it's a little bit of a long video, but I think it's really interesting because of some of just like the very, very small things that we can do that can make such a big difference. I'm not going to go through all of these because the video covered many of them, but I do want to talk about the foot in the door technique. This persuasion strategy involves getting a person to agree to a small request, like getting them to purchase a small item followed by making a much larger request. So by getting the person to agree to the small initial favor, the requester already has their foot in the door, making the individual more likely to comply with the larger request. So for example, say a neighbor asks you to babysit her 2 children for an hour or 2. And once you agree to that, she says, well, do you think you can stay for the rest of the night? Since you've already agreed to do the smaller request, you might feel a sense of obligation to also agree to the larger request. And this is a great example of what psychologists refer to as the rule of commitment, which marketers often use. The go big and go small approach is the opposite of the foot in the door technique. So a salesperson will begin by making a large, often unrealistic request. The individual responds by refusing, figuratively slamming the door on the sale. So the salesperson counters by making a much smaller request, which comes off as conciliatory and much more reasonable. People often feel obligated to respond to these offers. Since they refuse that initial request, people then feel compelled to help the salesperson by accepting the smaller request. And finally, the video touched on this a little bit, but the person that's attempting to persuade you has quite a bit of impact on how persuasive their argument's going to be. So we're much more likely to believe a message if the messenger is attractive. Ever notice that salespeople tend to be highly attractive? That's why. We're also more likely to believe a sales pitch if it comes from someone who seems credible. So you ever see all those medication commercials on TV? They always feature people in lab coats. The idea being, well, this person looks like a doctor, so they must be knowledgeable about medication. And we're more positively disposed to people that resemble us. So as a young white woman, I might be more inclined to be persuaded by another young white woman due to these similarity effects. So that brings us to the end. In our final lecture for our week on social psychology, we're going to talk about prejudice and discrimination. I'll see you all then.